Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Two Pupils in a Pod. We are your hosts for the show, Fatima and Sakina, and we're super delighted to have you back for our third episode.
Yes, today on the Education Empire, we'll be talking about the impact of COVID-19 on the education sector. Now, the education sector is a group of institutions which consists of ministries of education, local educational authorities, schools, universities, etc., all of which are primarily concerned with imparting education.
Yes,
So, we'll basically be seeing the impact that COVID 19 has had on the macro environment of education.
exactly. So, COVID-19, everybody has been talking about it. Everybody was super updated, initially, but soon
Hmm,
after, like in this point of time, it has sort of died down. And initially, when it all started, the first dilemma that policymakers had was to decide whether they wanted to, keep the schools open and let the
right,
people continue their jobs, or whether to shut down the schools completely so that the virus could be curbed. So this was a
right,
big, confusion that policymakers had.
exactly. But I mean, at the beginning, it was a choice. But as the situation escalated, they had no choice. I mean, it became very clear what had to be done. So I think the closure of schools started first in China in
Yeah.
January. And then, when WHO declared a public health emergency, subsequently, almost all the countries in the world, announced periods of lockdown, resulting
Hmm.
in closing down of schools and universities by the end of March.
Right. And statistics show that, 106 countries are currently implementing nationwide closures, which means there's complete lockdown in their
Oh,
country, whereas 55 countries are implementing only local closures. So, accordingly, schools either had to shut down or remain open according to the governments. And UNICEF has shown that 98.6 percentage of the world's student population was affected. I mean, that's literally all
wow.
of us.
That's, yeah, exactly.
And approximately 1.725 billion learners are affected.
That's huge. That's huge.
Right.
So, like, we said that most of the schools implemented lockdowns in March, but most of these schools that closed, they didn't necessarily close in response to the pandemic. Uh, as in, like, some of them simply had their spring or summer breaks during that time, so they were closed as a reason of that. So maybe
Oh,
at that, yeah, so maybe at that point, it didn't seem like those countries, schools and universities and education sector as a whole was affected by the virus. But I mean, now that it's been what, 5 months since most of the countries have been under lockdown, so those countries too have been experiencing the effect of these closures, in the sense that finally now, I mean, they too have to resume studies. So they too are in a way now experiencing the impact of COVID-19.
yeah. But so, I mean, for these countries, it was much easier, since the pandemic just coincided with their holidays. But in majority of the countries, March and April is actually the final exam season. So
Right.
a lot of exams had to be conducted in this time, but then they were postponed, delayed, and eventually, most of them got cancelled.
I think what happened is that at the beginning, educators, they thought that, okay, maybe going ahead, the situation might get better. So with that
Yeah,
hope, they kept postponing the exams. But of course, the situation just got worse. So they eventually had to just cancel the examinations.
yeah. I mean, my own board exams, like the initial papers that we had to write, we wrote all of those, but in the end, one or two papers were actually cancelled because of this pandemic, because
Oh,
got so much worse, you know.
Right. I mean, I guess in that aspect, we were lucky because we were, able to write all of our examinations just a day or two before India announced the lockdown. So I guess in
Oh.
that sense, we were lucky. But I think the ones who were actually lucky were you guys, since you guys didn't even have to write like one or two papers.
Yeah, I mean, like it got cancelled and it was such a sigh of relief. I'm not even kidding. But
That's
then,
great. That's great.
yeah, it was, but then we were all worried about our results because we literally did not write one whole exam, you know. So schools definitely had to come up with other alternative solutions and other ways to promote students. So this wasn't really an issue for primary grades because, you know, it's an unspoken rule that up until secondary school, you know, kids are not really failed.
Yeah,
But I
correct.
think when we talk about seniors, the situation is different.
Definitely, yeah. And I think, for that reason, a lot of schools came up with various criteria to, promote their students. Some of them consider evaluating the performance of the students based on internal assignments, projects, and
Yeah,
basically all the other
notebook.
schoolwork, yeah, that the students did throughout the academic year. And a lot of other schools used something called predicted grades, which is
Yes.
kind of like an estimated grade that the teacher believes the student would have got under normal circumstances, that is, had
Hmm.
the examinations taken place. But don't you think that's sort of, I don't know, unfair or inaccurate?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, especially since we're considering all the students, you know, when we talk about disadvantageous students from lower backgrounds, you know, they don't really,
Yes, yes.
very inaccurate for them, and it's unfair, you know, to take this as a basis or take this as a criteria.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's also the teacher's bias, which, although it's unintentional, but like it's there.
It's
So,
definitely there.
yeah, so undeniably. So, there's that as well. But I think what universities did was something different. I mean, they came up with a set of safety net policies, and so these were, put in place to ensure that none of the students were at a disadvantage academically because of the current situation. So they were basically just a bunch of policies that were like in favor of students. So
Yeah.
some of them were like that the student could not score a grade lower than what they had received in their previous term or semester. And I think that's like a great policy because
Yeah.
uh, some universities, were unable to complete their academic term properly, as a result of which, maybe the syllabus wasn't completed, or the students didn't, get a chance to properly prepare for exams. So I think these policies were like great. But then, of course,
Yeah,
very few
definitely.
countries and very few universities went ahead with this.
Yeah, I mean, in this way, you know, teachers didn't have to break their heads to come up with some new policy, and even students got what they had already achieved. So it was like a win-win situation.
Yeah, exactly.
But then a lot of universities decided to go ahead with exams, and the only way to do so was through online examinations. And
Of course.
there's a lot of trial, there's a lot of error and uncertainty regarding online exams, you know. And these were not so viable for all the students in all the universities because it's a relatively new
Correct.
area.
Definitely, definitely. I mean, we've all been talking about, switching to digital learning for years now, but like since it all happened so quickly, that area hasn't been developed as it should have to, carry all this
Right,
out successfully. So, like you said, because of that, there's been a lot of trial and error, and like definitely a larger measurement error than usual.
right. And
And
that's just like the tip of the mountain. We've already
exactly,
spoken in detail about this in our previous episode, which was such a great debate. And I'm sure if you haven't listened to it yet, you need to go and listen to the
listen to
previous
it
episode.
right now,
Yes,
because we talk about the advantages and disadvantages of both online and traditional learning.
yeah, and I'm sure you'll get a better idea after you listen to that.
Right.
So,
And I
and
think
you know,
another major issue with online assessments is that the current syllabus, right? I mean, it was designed for pen and paper tests. So,
yeah, exactly.
the essay type questions, I mean, those are the kind of questions that the current syllabus was designed for, like I said. But online tests, as we know, are standardized. They contain MCQ type questions, etc. So, honestly, I mean, you cannot judge that syllabus through standardized tests. So I think that's like another, problem with online assessments.
Right. And since we're talking about examinations, this was also the time when government and competitive exams,
Oh,
public
yes,
assessment,
yes,
SATs, all of these tests are held. So the whole schedule of a normal student's life has been affected and it has been disrupted in so many ways. Like the
completely.
exams were delayed, dropped, replaced, and like so many things happened in between. So again,
Exactly,
policymakers have to tackle the challenge of how and when to conduct these exams.
exactly. And now moving on from examinations, I think the other area of like major concern has been resuming studies,
Exactly.
continuing the learning process. And for this purpose, most of the schools and universities shifted to remote online learning. But mind
Yeah,
you, this shift happened only in a handful of private schools and universities,
right.
because most of the government schools and universities, or the ones in the low income countries, they simply did not have the resources and the technology to adopt online teaching, right? So these
Exactly.
schools and universities have had to completely shut down for not having access to e-learning solutions.
Yeah,
So
and I
I think
mean, lack of resources, lack of technology, it has affected students, especially in the most remote and vulnerable areas. 40% of
exactly,
and lower middle income countries have been unable to support the poor, linguistic minorities, and other students with disabilities. And this has increased dropout rates, which is a difficult situation for the society. Digital learning has its own pros and cons, but it will definitely impact every individual student and it will impact the retention rate of students and
of course,
even tuition revenues will have to decline.
definitely. I mean, we've already seen, students and parents demanding that the fees be reduced, and I mean,
Right.
rightly so. They're no longer availing campus or university facilities, right? They're using their own
Hmm.
resources, and they're having to incur so many other expenses, especially students who are living, in other countries, who have not been able to return to their own country. So I
Yeah,
think their demands are fair, but of course, this again has had a huge impact on universities. I mean, they have been put under financial burden. They're under a lot of risk, like of losing out on students, and the dropout rates also, like you said, have increased
yeah, and I mean it's
significantly.
it's a period of financial crisis for everyone. Everybody's
Right.
been working hard, and on the university side, they are unable to offer scholarships, and students are unable to, pay these tuition fees. So really, students are now considering uh, to take a gap year, and they
Right,
really
right.
want a break from education altogether, or at least until things are normal.
Of course. I mean, whether you look at like the financial aspect of it, or students are wanting to pursue higher education in other countries, since there's been a restriction on international travel because of the pandemic,
Yeah,
that too is the cross border movement of students will definitely take a beating. And this is going to, lead to a great loss for universities, because in countries like USA, UK, Australia, these countries are highly dependent on income from international students from countries like India, China, etc. So a lot of
exactly.
students may, want to reconsider the choice of whether or not to go abroad for higher education.
Yeah, I mean, students have been very hesitant right now, to enroll in fall or summer semesters, and this will sort of continue for 2 to 3 years, depending on the situation.
Exactly. And, since this has affected the retention rates for universities, we're seeing a new wave of schools that are in fact considering resetting their tuition policies. So, they're either lowering the tuition fees or offering incentives to continue, enrollment, etc. And
Absolutely. I mean, it's necessary, Times like these require changes.
definitely. And this has also um, affected the admissions overall, because again, this is a time where fresh admissions take place, be it, for nursery
Yeah,
or for universities. So as a result of, all of these issues, universities are now relooking their admission practices, their criteria, the recruitment process, and basically all of their policies, uh, so that students can and will enroll, because there's a
yeah,
serious fear of losing students and decrease in retention rates.
right. And they need to come up with these new methods because the whole application process, it needs to be defined for times like these. And my own application, in fact, in university, my actual results were not out in time, so I had to
Okay.
submit my predicted grades in order
Oh,
to um, enroll myself into a university. So really things have to be changed, and I'm sort of glad, change is happening. I am hopeful. There's been a
yeah.
drastic change.
I mean, I think if we give it some time, we may be looking at some permanent changes, in the education sector.
Right.
And I think with time, these changes will happen, but like in a more developed, organized way, so that
Okay.
everyone can benefit from it properly. Because right now we've only looked at how, the education sector has been impacted, and it has been impacted in almost every area, whether you look at admissions or, examinations, or, just continuing
Finance.
of the learning process, finance, yes.
Right.
But the other side
You
of
know,
this, stakeholders.
right. Teachers, parents, students, we all have been affected by this, and we are definitely going to address this in our next episode, where we're going to talk about how you and me, all of us on an individual level, have been affected.
Right. And we're really curious to know how COVID-19 has affected you and your education, etc. So do let us know what your individual experience has been through our Instagram Q&A.
Yes, definitely. And you can also reach out to us on our Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and our email, all under the same name, Two Pupils in a Pod.
For more details, you can visit our website www.twopupilsinapod.com. That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening and supporting us. Signing off until next time, we are your hosts, Sakina and Fatima.